Hello and welcome to the Media Renaissance Show. This is Michael Fiorentino and I'm here today with Trees De Bruyne. We're going to go over how we met. We're going to talk about environment, AI regulation, Europe as an ecosystem as a whole. And of course, we're going to talk about the Renaissance era, this time applying more to the northern countries and their Renaissance, Belgium, and kind of just whatever we want to talk about. So welcome. Thank you for coming.
I'm glad to be here.
Maybe we should start with just saying, how do we know each other? How did we meet and go into the Media Motor Europe program?
It's quite funny because actually I used to be a TV producer. So I've been producing TV shows and movies and documentaries. And the last couple of years, I've been coaching startups in deep tech in the media industry. And that's actually how we met. And I think because I have an analytic brain and a creative brain, because I also have some degrees in garden design and interior design. And I used to have an art gallery where we find a mutual connection because you were into arts as well, and combining that with complex digital stuff. I think that's maybe why we're still connected.
I think so. And I think we also share an ethos or opinion, let's say, a strong opinion about how digital media should be run with the tech companies versus the creators and just society as a whole. And I notice other people kind of tiptoe around it. They're very polite, and you just bulldoze over it. You're like, no, this is how it should be.
It's because I have this wake-up call, and you could call it midlife crisis. It's the moment in time where men start ditching their wife, get a motorcycle and start traveling around the world and get a younger partner. I just got a wake-up call because I discovered that everything that I'm doing was so polluting if you look at the impact of digital on ecological. But it was also the moment in time where my brother-in-law killed himself. So it was like those moments where you think like, oh my God, what am I doing with the rest of my life? And I think it was always there. I think the idea of being more conscious that we're here on Earth for a certain period in time and we need to leave it better than we got it. So I think, and that's where we connected philosophically, thinking a bit differently, a bit more out of the box. That's something I feel you're passionate about as well. You're not afraid to have a strong opinion because what else is there?
We have a lot to break down just based on everything you just said.
Yeah.
I really want to hear about all this exciting change, zooming out and seeing the macro perspectives of data policy and the economy.
If I zoom in, Media Motor Europe actually was a great project. Thanks to funding from the European Union, really was intended to mentor and coach startups and scale-ups and help them to focus a bit more on sales, how to get out there, because there's a lot of money going to new technology that could really help to experience storytelling, because for me, media and technology is just about storytelling. It's like the fireplace. Ages ago, we had the fireplace and people talk.
Yeah, or a campfire, tribal times. We were sitting around the campfire at night, cooking up I'm vegetarian now, but, people were eating meat and they would just tell stories, and that's how imagination evolved.
If you dismantle it, it's about stories from the past who are passed on to the younger generation. And it's about community building and gathering people, feeling, tasting, hearing. So it's actually what makes us human. I believe that technology should be to really reconnect people. And that's what you did with your technology. It was about telling stories. And we cannot underestimate the importance of the space to do that.
Yeah, and I think that we're spending more time in digital environments, but what exists around us should be more of what we want or what we subconsciously want or what we've stated that we want instead of what a corporation has sort of force-fed to us. I'll rewind and just say what Media Motor Europe is. Media Motor Europe is an accelerator program for startups across Europe. The goal was to really interconnect. And it was interesting because they didn't take equity, they didn't invest in companies monetarily, but they did give money to support mentors and programs and ecosystems. And I was actually in the Sofia Knowledge City group out of Bulgaria, even though I'm in a Portuguese startup. There was a Thessaloniki group. I think there was a Belgium conglomerate, and there was one in Norway, I think. And they kind of got money from, as I call, Mama Europe. I think part of this is a response to the fact that America is a little more homogenized. If you work in New York or California, you're in the same country.
If you reflect on that, I think the big difference indeed is that it's really uniting startups coming from a completely different culture. If you look at how Europe is scattered, it's quite complex. So there's a big difference. There's a big gap between those different countries. It's almost like an NGO. We're just going to nurture the startups and really help them and mentor them and coach them. without asking something in return except for their time and their dedication to really follow the program. It gives a completely different dynamic than a normal accelerator program where it's far more money driven and they're really steering your idea into something that's monetizable in a very fast way. You can have a longer development phase if you compare it with other accelerator programs.
I can speak to that as someone with a longer than normal development phase. So when I submitted the application, it was companies that are looking for solutions with data-based economies that don't rely on the use of personal data, or at least have data policies that are regulated based on what European law is. The term that we say is surveillance economy. So the issue is when you're on a lot of free social networks, you're not paying for anything, but you're seeing ads that are put in there and the ads are targeted towards you. And that's the industry that I used to work in New York for over 10 years. The benefit is that you see content that's more relevant to who you are. But the downside is that there's a aggregation of data that builds over time that knows exactly what you want. And I think an extreme form of that is probably TikTok, where you don't even have a button to say exactly what you want next. It's just going to guess everything. With the creation of GDPR, and now they have the Digital Services Act and the AI bill and all these other policies. They're really the ones in the world who are saying, we care about this. We don't care if people make less money as long as it's better for society.
So the reason why Europe is investing so much in those startup and scale-up landscapes and new technology, if you look at it, the domination of those big techs, you have Facebook, the Googles, the TikTok guys, and there's actually no European player operating in that field. There's a big fear of losing that cultural identity. And even if you look at Europe, everything they do in Europe, they translate it in every language of every small state. So they do want to really preserve the cultural identity of all those little states. They don't want one language or one source of type of content. And I think the whole GDPR, it's the law that tells everyone that you own your own data and you actually can, at a certain moment in time, ask your own data back and have the right to be forgotten, which is very powerful. Because I know someone at a certain moment. So they asked Amazon, give me all the data that you have on my account. And it was a pile of data. I think it was a pile of paper. It could fill up my room. And then they asked to be forgotten. And really, it was very annoying. But it's really something to do and to challenge because you have the right to own your own data. If you want to have such a big territory that really unites, and if you try to reinforce your cultural identity to a small area or a member state, it doesn't work. People will fight back. I also see even today, regardless of the GDPR, and I think we have the whole post-COVID area that happened, the number of cameras in the street, surveillance, the digital passport, who is doing what, where.
Or even paying with a credit card versus cash.
It's a whole debate. I'm a big favorite of trying to keep cash alive because I think we don't notice it, but slowly we are losing our freedom.
Yeah, I think on the other extreme, we have the cryptocurrency world where it's about complete anonymity, but not really. And then that could be used for bad reasons or good reasons, just people spend money and own assets. So one thing I wanted to mention, so GDPR, General Data Privacy Regulation Act, came across, I think, 2018. Part of the reason actually why I moved to Europe was because I was starting to build in the US and I realized that Europe was evolving very quickly and the US was in this stagnant period where they weren't changing, but I knew that they were ultimately going to move there. So by being here, by being immersed, by being in these accelerator programs, I got to see the perspective of Europe. And I hear what you're saying about the concern about, it sounds like you're calling it digital colonialism, where American companies are exporting culture or at least interfaces that people interact with. And so I think that the counter response to that is GDPR set a list of rules. And they said, look, you have the right to be forgotten, but also when you go on a website in the US, you just go on a website and it collects your cookie data, at least it used to more than it does now, and it starts creating a profile about you. Maybe it's violating your personal identity, maybe it's not. It just depends on what the rules are. Honestly, what state of the US you're in. Illinois is more strict, California, New York, but if you're in, I don't know, Idaho, they might have a different policy. Generally, when you get enough people in the US to have a certain law, it does apply to everyone because it's just easier to fix that. So a couple things about GDPR are generally when you collect data about a user, you're only supposed to keep it for 90 days and then you should delete it.
And only keep what you need.
Yeah, you have to list what you need And you can't just take data in case you don't need it.
No, and I believe it's quite powerful. And they're even looking at taking it to a higher level. It's the whole, oh, how is it called again? Solid. So, Solid is a new technology that they're looking at. You could say that you own your own digital passport and you decide within that type of connector who can have your data and what he can do with it. I would say it's almost like a connector. I would be happy, you remember all those newsletters you subscribe to, and you have all those subscriptions in one wallet, and you can say, no, not this one anymore. You could compare it to something like that. And so they're really been experimenting with these types of digital identities to give the ownership to the user. It seems great on the surface, but there's also a big danger to that, because as long as it's in the good hands, it's okay. But the moment everyone is having this digital passport, then someone on top can say, yeah, but now I'm going to decide who's going to travel where. There's this whole thing about the 15-minute cities.
I keep hearing this phrase, and I first heard about it on more of an urbanism podcast that was more saying we should have food here, we should be able to have public transport, we should be able to have walkability, which I love. There is this undertow of people who are skeptical about this idea that it might be a control, like top-down mechanism. Tell me your take on the 15-minute
Yeah.
city.
In Europe, you have the European Bauhaus. Like you have the Green Deal, and the Green Deal, it's all about we need to live in a more sustainable way. We have to reduce our CO2 by 2050. And European Bauhaus is about uniting culture, arts, architects, really the new way of living. You could compare it a little bit to the Renaissance, but the Bauhaus was really in the art movement, where it was about the industrialization of beautiful things so that they were accessible to a lot more people. So they call it the New European Bauhaus, and they had a festival of 5 days where all these great architects and creative people came together and really debated about stuff like that. But there's this famous architect, I don't remember his name, but he's a French guy, and he also did a lot of urban planning in Brazil and Argentina. And the way he explains it, it's actually offering people, anyone who is living in these cities, the possibility to, within 15 minutes, have access to food, healthcare, transportation, so that you have these small mini cities in bigger cities. It seems like an ideal world. Here in Belgium, might be the same in America, but you have a lot of houses that are scattered all over the place. So what they really want to do is they want to give those types of grounds back to nature, create more green spaces, and that, of course, those people need to live somewhere. So they want to build these bigger cities that are where everyone is living, but then make sure is that within those big entities, you have your small community where you can do whatever you want to do.
And that sounds good because cars are expensive. I personally don't like driving for commuting. I very rarely drive unless I'm going on a great road trip or something. And most American places, you're in a suburb. So it's just a bunch of houses. For example, if you're in New Jersey, you have to drive for 20 minutes to go somewhere, maybe drive 10 minutes, but you're not walking there. You're not taking an Uber there even sometimes, unless it's like a party night. But in Europe, it actually usually is designed more to be these communities where people are living in apartments more, they're taking public transportation, it's more reliable. So what's the downside of these 15-minute cities?
What people are fearing, if you combine it with a digital passport that is actually telling you where you can go and not go, is that they will be secluded to those small areas, and they won't, unless you follow the rules, have the ability to move from one area to the other. And you have no ability to travel anywhere else.
Yeah, that's quite different than freedom of movement, which was one of the foundations of the European Union. So, what I had learned, and it was actually someone that presented at Media Motor Europe, was that in East Germany, in the Cold War era, everyone was kind of encouraged to spy on each other and report it back. And so, when the Berlin Wall fell and all these new countries were being created, or let's say like reestablished, like the Baltic nations and Germany especially, the mentality was, let's not know everyone's health history. Let's not know everyone's personal details. Let's try to protect that privacy. The internet is established and scales a few years after that. And so when that happens, the mentality of these countries were saying, let's apply that same protection to people in their online environments. It didn't really become a common conversation until I would say maybe 2010, where everyone has a phone in their pocket and there's a prolific use of social media. But I noticed that policies about even digital outdoor billboards in, let's say, Sweden or the Netherlands is different than a lot of other countries in the world. So in the US, sometimes we have cameras to track people looking at a billboard sign. And you're saying, well, we want to know who's reacting to it. We want to give the
Yeah.
advertiser the data. So we're saying this is a mom, they're 38 years old. Would they be interested in the shoe or not? And one example I heard was that in Europe, you have to take that footage of people. It has to go through a police station, like a security camera, to blind their face, and then it could go to the advertiser, but it's been processed. Those
Yeah.
laws don't exist in other parts of the world. That's not even a consideration.
You know what is so funny? I used to work with a gamer and I was creating a virtual world for kids. You know, he was a gadget guy. And he says, I have no fear at all in sharing whatever I'm doing because I have nothing to hide. But then at a certain moment in time, I told him, but you know how much your data is worth to a Facebook? It's worth 150 euros or dollars. I don't think that there's much difference anymore. But I said to him, do you agree that someone is just with your data, with stuff you do, is earning money? And you don't even actually know what they do with it. So that made him think what is happening. And actually, if you look at it, if someone takes your picture, puts it on Facebook, it's almost impossible to be forgotten. Some silly, stupid picture of me as a young person doing something stupid at a party, it will haunt me for life. And we have now, at this moment in time, a major dropout of politicians who just stop politics. And why? Is because the pressure on social media is so high and they get bullied. So in the last week, for instance, the Dutch government, they had a row, so they split up. And four of the major politicians in 1 week, after 20, 13 or more years of politics, have just decided to quit because of the social media pressure. I think we took it too far.
I think that's fair. And I think that a lot of the politicians of the future are going to be people who did post too much on social media, and everyone's just going to not care. You know, it's like you could try to use it against them, but at some point we're going to say, yeah, so did everyone else that was, 19 years old and in a
Yes.
university.
And that is interesting because if you look at the boundaries that are fading, and it's because now people are starting to harass their families and their kids. And that's where those people say, I draw a line. And that's a dangerous evolution because we're not commenting anymore on what someone else is saying and we don't like it. And we're just going to shout it out loud and say, I don't like what you're saying. That is a very dangerous evolution. I'm not sure where that will take us. Huh?
Well, there's also this split I've noticed between Europe and the United States, where freedom of speech is in our First Amendment. So the concept of telling someone that they can't express themselves has a big legal protection. And the difference is in Europe, if somebody says blatant misinformation or anything that could hurt somebody, it could just be taken down. The laws in the US are saying that if you post something to social media, the company is not liable for what is said as long as there is a takedown policy if it violates certain standards. If there's not a takedown policy, then you have a problem and the company can be liable. It's the individual that posts on someone else's service that is legally liable. And in Europe, it's just a little different. It's a slight change, but it actually impacts a lot of how people behave and what governments can and cannot do.
You know, when you used to say something, freedom of speech, the impact of what you said was not spread all over the world in a second. Now you should almost have the freedom of speech, but with a time frame to rephrase what you say to experience what would be the impact is.
I like
Because
that.
freedom of speech with a kind of delay. You know, when you're mad, you type an email or you send an SMS and then you press send. And then the moment you press send, you think, oh, I should have rephrased that a little bit. Huh? So I think you should say you press send and then actually have a kind of button says, are you really sure you want the whole world to know this?
Okay.
But
Well,
yeah,
and here's the other thing with misinformation and freedom of speech, which goes into our next topic, is how do we know what's real and what's fake? How do we know what's deep fake? How do we know what's edited by AI or versus created by a human? And this is becoming a more pressing issue. So one of
yeah,
the ways that we reconnected was because I looked at the submission for OpenAI's call for democratic management, and they wanted to do a grant program and give 10 companies $100,000 to do research on a specific aspect of democracy and management for artificial intelligence and how it's decided. And so I had ideas about it. And I thought, you were in Media Motor Europe. You were exposed to a lot of companies and their philosophies. And I, messaged you, I reached out and I said, hey, are you interested in submitting this with me and doing a study together if we do get accepted? And you said yes, but only if we throw a lot of clauses about how to manage the environment and we make sure these tech companies are accountable for what's happening in ecosystems that include environmental concerns.
I have a hate-love relationship with AI. Could do great things with it, but you need to use it cleverly. People go to the gym and then you see them opening the trunk of their car with their keys because the trunk opens automatically. And then they do this. Get off your butt. Just open your trunk. Go to the light. Don't ask Alexa to open and do stuff. We're using technology for stupid things, and you should use it for what it is intended to be. And I think AI has a great role to play in using data to predict stuff like weather or whatever. But when it comes into giving you knowledge that will, how you call it, change the way you think about stuff as a human, without knowing where it's coming from and how it's trained and if it's right or wrong, then I think we're entering a very dangerous zone. And also, we forget that all that data needs to be stored on servers. It needs computing power. They eat up energy. It's an impact to the environment. It's massive. So use it wisely. It's not like you're going to use an F-16 to travel from New York to Washington. And I have the feeling that we're using an F-16 to travel to Washington.
To make
It's
some
not
AI selfies.
some AI selfies. We don't feel the impact of the decisions that we're making because it's somewhere out there in the cloud,
It's
and
externalized.
it's externalized. What I see happening here, you have Mieke de Ketelaar. She used to be head of IMEC, and IMEC is one of the biggest scientific research centers in Belgium, but now they get a huge funding from Europe as well. So they're quite big and connected all over Europe. And she says, what we need, what we are really missing in the whole AI debate is the ethical layer. We should have something like philosophers, moral judges. Now you have a CTO, he's going crazy. He develops something he thinks is great. Within a company, they only think about the money. Of course, it's how our economic model is built. But there's no one in there in between who is saying, wait a minute, what are we doing?
So one thing I want to go into is the OpenAI grant proposal. They were asking questions and they proposed certain thoughts, and we kind of submitted it under the guise of other. But I'm going to just summarize a couple of the ones that stood out, and then we're going to say what our question was in the proposal. One of them was, how do you think the personalization of AI assistants should align to users' tastes and preferences, and what boundaries should exist? I kind of find that boring and kind of obvious. Let's see. Under what conditions should AI assistants be allowed to provide medical, financial, or legal advice? That's kind of important. In what cases, if any, should AI assistants offer emotional support to individuals? How do you feel about that one?
I think history already in Belgium. We had someone who killed himself because the chatbot said, "If I was you, I would kill myself." Huh?
Wow.
I'm not sure if you know
Oh,
that.
chatbots that do get into the let's say intense aspects of the human condition in terms of
Yeah,
love and life and death and all these things, but they don't understand the weight of it. And we do recreate it in our stories and in our texts whether it's studying, but there's not this nuance of, is that appropriate to say? Is that going to have an impact on someone? We would learn that by the time we're 6 years old, but AI kind of isn't even 6 years old yet, so they don't
no,
have that context.
no.
Another question they had was,
Yeah.
should joint vision language models be permitted to identify someone's gender, race, emotion, and identity? What do
Oh,
you think?
I had this whole debate because we did some proof of concepts with a startup, actually also in the Media Motor Europe program. There was a startup who was training models to identify gender and cultural and race. And I just said to them, okay, so what about me? How would you categorize me? Because one, I mixed. My father was from Rwanda. My mother was from Belgium. I've been adopted as a baby. I was born in Brussels. And actually, if you look at me, I could be half Afro-American, I could be Nubian, I could be whatever.
And you're Belgian and you're Flemish, is that what you'd say?
Yeah, I'm Flemish. And actually, even within Flanders, you have all these different regions. And I'm from West Flanders, so I speak that dialect. And I said, what will the brain say about me? And it went silent. And they had no idea what to say. They wanted to use it actually to see if whatever footage they are sharing on the public broadcaster, they have to report if it's gender equal. Now, to give you an idea, when I started working at a public broadcaster in Belgium, I was raised in a little village and I was the first Black in the village. So I was like, oh, can I touch your hair and your skin? You might not imagine how that is in America, but here in the little village I grew up with, that was the case.
Yeah, that's not okay in America. I think it's not okay anywhere, but I think we have enough cultural exposure and diversity.
And maybe that's why I always speak up, because I was always one of the odd bunch. When you go to school, everyone around me was white. I don't look at myself every single moment of the day as being Black. My son's dad is white. And I remember that we went to a jazz concert and there was these African Americans, and they were actually shouting at us and saying, why are you with this white guy? And I thought, like, but wait a minute, what's the problem? So I experienced more racism from actually Afro-Americans and really Black persons from Africa than within the white society. But I was always quite a loner. And at VRT, when I worked there, you know, you go to a party and then you see only a few of us Black. And then what happens is whenever they take a picture, we're in the picture. And I always laugh about it. And I said, hey, there we go. We're going to be in the picture again, like some rarity. And at a certain moment in time, I wrote them a letter and I said, I had it. I said, if you really want to have gender equality and you pretend that you are thinking about diversity, you should make sure is that your employees are diverse, that whatever the people you have on the screen are diverse enough. And the last couple of years, I have to say, they did try, but it's not easy because it's still a long road to be as diverse as what I see in America and even in the UK. We're still not there yet. And then when you then say we're going to use AI to see if we're diverse enough, but then I think, what will you mean with diversity? Will you look at the people's outside? I've never really been to Africa. Am I then an example of being a part of adding to the diversity? It's strange, eh?
I think so too. And I think definitely in different regions of Europe and cities, they're more multicultural. You know, you think that a French person looks a certain way or someone that's Swedish. But if you go to these, especially capital cities, it is a melting pot. There is a lot of immigration, but there are regions. And I think in the United States, we have less of a connection of, let's say, race and country, whereas Europe does have this traditional perception of it. There's more to evolve past to understand that there is someone's country of origin, someone's what we would call race or background, and also their history. It could be socioeconomic, it could be educational, it could be gender identity, which is the more recent frontier, which also relates to one of the other proposed questions they had that said, what principles should AI have when they handle human rights or cultural legal differences? So, for example, LGBTQ rights and women's rights. And should AI change its response based on location? That's a lot. So, for example, if you're in, let's say, a country that has strict laws against, say, LGBTQ individuals, should AI give a response that even acknowledges their existence, or should that be illegal? How do you deal with that? That's a mess. I would say on probably a little easier level, we have Europe and the United States. More recently, I think that there's a lot in common in terms of how the treatment of women's equality and LGBT rights has evolved. I think in some areas it's moving backwards. And so when you create AI, it could literally be dangerous for somebody to be targeted or identified as being in that subsection depending on where you live. So for example, I'm married, and when I go with my husband to certain countries like Europe, it's fine. If we go to certain places, let's say in the Caribbean, we're cousins. Sometimes I feel like being an advocate and saying, hey, you better make sure there's a bed that fits both of us. None of these like push two beds together. I'm paying for this just like anyone else would. And other times I say, you know what? We're just not going to bring this up. We're going to like just, they can assume whatever they want, but we're not going to like make a point of it because it's actually a safety concern.
Yeah, it's a dangerous world. Eh? Maybe something to think about is what if we replace AI by the judge? Let's give him the persona of a judge. Do you think if you now ask the same question you asked, suddenly if you give AI a human face, you suddenly think differently about what AI can do and not can do?
And the power that we give it.
Because we give it the judging power. Can the judge decide what you read or not read? Can the judge make a decision about what you will see or not see?
So let's get back to OpenAI and what we submitted as a proposal, because it does take a similar consideration into account. So they said, what is your question if it's not one of those questions that we had asked previously? And so we wrote, how should AI models and algorithms be managed for platforms that use curated, in parentheses, programmatic, and generated content? What are the implications related to making these models interchangeable and managed by different roles? So that could be private tech companies, government compliance organizations, user data collectives, and nonprofit entities. And what kind of measures can be implemented to establish a system of checks and balances that safeguard against potential systemic abuse? That's a lot. So that was our question. And this sort of was born out of the concepts that I was writing in the original patent that I submitted, where I said, okay, we have a marketplace ecosystem where you're exchanging media. It's programmatic, meaning that the content is customized to individuals. But the assumption now is that a tech company makes those decisions by deciding who's seeing what or how the algorithm is done. And it's in typically this opaque box, and you don't know how it's run. And I, after being in programs like Media Motor Europe and being exposed to those concepts, a lot of the ideas came to mind about, well, Europe wants a wider net of companies interacting, and they want more transparency, and they want to think about society over commercial gain. So the question is, who's controlling the AI models and who's controlling the algorithms? And how would it be different if it was someone else doing it? So that's kind of the roles that we took, and we had to design a study proposal around this.
And I think what is great is that because you, with your background of coming from the advertising industry, where you really see how you have the creativity, because you have the big pressure to sell and to market stuff, and you're pressured by the whole economics of using creativity and art to sell and consume goods. And I think, especially with your background, and I believe with your vision on how AI could rule the world and actually prevent us from having this freedom. I think you really nailed the question that was not in one of their suggestions they made, because whatever you do, everything you do needs to be advertised. So even if they had the question about can you use AI in healthcare and whatever, at a certain moment things need to be advertised. And if you don't understand what is the danger of using AI in that level and not being transparent on the choices that were made, it will affect every layer of whatever we do, from politics, from healthcare, from education. And it's actually the major question you need to ask, because whatever you do today, it needs to be advertised, it needs to be promoted, and it needs to be out there. So I think it was visionary to ask the question on transparency on algorithms, because that's what it is. If you don't know why the decisions are made, then it's not about freedom of speech. Actually, it's someone else who is speaking for you. It's someone else taking over your thoughts, your ideas, and you don't know who that person is. It's very dangerous.
I agree. I think that so right now we have private companies that decide the algorithms that we're seeing, but actually part of the AI bill that Europe has now made official says that you have to have a version of explainable models or explainable use cases where you say, this is how we're using it, this is the interpretation. And so there's this question of what was the model data, how was it trained, who's controlling this, how is it edited? And by the way, this is difficult when you're working in, let's say, the US, or it could be Latin American countries or Europe, and the laws are all different in different places. So we might be moving from this World Wide Web to this splinter net, right, where it splinters off in different pieces.
Yeah.
We've already lost China and Russia to their own internet ecosystems, or pretty much any authoritarian government is going to be controlling their digital communication channels.
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
Europe almost is in the complete opposite direction. One of the terms I like to use is apolitical data socialism. So that's this
Okay,
concept of
interesting. Yeah,
well, I don't want it to be politics about like, left or right, progressive or conservative, although I would say it's more on the progressive, forward leaning side. But when you say data socialism, it's like, how do you broker your own data, or how does the way that your data is managed, or sort of digital commerce, impact society in a larger scale instead of just for purely capitalistic concerns? Because right
yeah,
now, surveillance economy is totally capitalism. And then you have sort of authoritarian governments that use their digital work to control people. And then what I would say is this, what I would call apolitical data socialism, is this concept that we're, of course, living in a modern technology world, but we have to have policies in place so that when we create content or put it out there, that there's some sort of rules to manage this so that it doesn't
yeah.
wreak havoc on our society and the development of pretty much everyone's well-being. Any European company thinks about this, and especially Media Motor Europe, was the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. You can't give a presentation in Europe without saying, here's the UN Sustainable Development Goals that I am helping to achieve by having my company. That's such a fundamental thought to how people do things. Are you creating partnership goals? Are you helping the seas? Are you dealing with infrastructure and economy issues? Are you helping equality? Like, this is such a thought that Europe has.
Yeah, and I think what is also interesting is that they're thinking, I'm not sure if it's part of that law, is that you have to put a kind of sign on when you use the AI, for instance, in imaging or in creating footage. I know that you're a big fan of Europe and what they're doing, but I'm not sure if it goes fast enough.
Oh, it
I
definitely doesn't. It's There's not enough money and it's way too slow. And my issue with and criticism of Europe, as much as I like a lot of the policies, is that they'll sit and think about things. They're like, yeah, we should think about that. Let's do a study. Let's do a 5 year study. And it's like, meanwhile, all these other countries have built all this technology. So in some areas, there is a rapid infrastructure build. I do think with the Web3 economy, especially here in Lisbon, Portugal, there's a lot more embracing, and let's make a rule, let's make a law, let's like kind of create things as quickly as we can and figure out what the rules are. Whereas in some countries are saying, we're just going to ban cryptocurrency or Web3 economics, and they're missing out on a new development of technology that could be potentially helpful. So I agree. Europe definitely slower, but it's because they care about people.
My biggest fear, we're moving so fast with technology that we're losing a lot of people.
What do you mean by losing a lot of people?
I see a lot of things happening. You have people, one, who cannot follow the pace of the speed of digital and who are not digital at all. I think there's still 15% of people who can't actually afford internet, uh, who don't have a PC, who are lacking, who are really struggling to cope. We also have a layer of people who are a bit afraid of the pace in which AI and those new technologies are taking over, and who are really choosing to step out of it and really are protesting. So they're not rebelling. They are not shouting out loud, but there's this underground of people who are saying, we don't believe in the way things are moving and heading because it's going fast. And they see that the AI for the good is not as powerful as the AI for the bad. Eh? So they
I don't know.
really
I think opting out of that completely is, I guess it takes a lot of courage to not have the support of the existing structures, the powers that be in terms of economic growth, governments. If you don't have a government helping you and you have to do everything on your own, medical care, healthcare, food, basic rights, sort of social safety net, I guess some people can do that. But to do it and say that you're going to do that because technology isn't going to be managed correctly, it's like almost like you're opting out of the system and just letting it all happen. Like, it's almost in some ways better to be in the system and part of the system in the world to help move it to the direction you want to. So have you heard any
yeah.
of the arguments against that movement?
I think that they believe that there's going to be a domino effect where you have
Okay.
a lot of different people starting doing it. See here in when it comes to governance and politics, media, AI, the whole fake news, what is news, not news. It's very hard for people to still see the difference. With all this communication, you don't learn at school how to deal with all that information. There's this
Exactly.
There's this great thing, it's called connectivism. It's from two Canadian people. It's a way to teach kids how to deal with it in the digital world, how to survive. And it all has to do with change, because you have this constant change. So what you think is today A will be B tomorrow, which is not a problem. But you need to be able to cope with this constant change, and especially to understand what our source is and make your own opinion, because that's it. You have now this huge world, an abundance of information and communication and stories that's coming towards you that you have to digest, but you have to come up with your own story and your own truth. For doing that, you need to be skilled and you need to be strong enough as a person to deal with that, because you have the peer pressure. And I think those people, they believe by not participating in this governance and media society, really having ownership of everything, they believe that it's going to spread and that more people will want to step out of it. So I'm not sure what will happen, but sometimes the change comes from the underground.
Well, this is the first time I've heard of it. It sounds interesting. I think that the commonality that I think we all can agree on is that having a digital literacy and critical thinking is so important. The fact that you're not just accepting what's given to you, but why is it there? What is my participation in this? Is this actually what I want? And certain people count calories when they eat food, and some people just eat whatever tastes good. And it's okay if you're eating junk food and you know that you're eating that, but it's not okay if you're given food and there's items that are put in there that you're not aware of that could have negative effects. And I think that we have that with certain food and drug regulation, and we're just moving into a digital regulation period that has that. And sometimes they call that like the nanny state, where you have someone that's controlling everything. And sometimes I think that's good, actually. So at some point, it turns into overt control, and there's this movement about how do we have complete freedom versus how do we have a social safety net.
Yeah.
Which actually, this ties into the question. So one of the things they asked was, what is your main question for this OpenAI study? And then they ask us how we do the study. So I'm going to go through that quickly. One of the things they said was, why do you think the question, the one that we asked before, is suited to broader public input? So one of the answers, I think I wrote this one, that said, the broader public often feels powerless to big tech companies and AI, but they're interested in new ways to manage and participate in this process. Also, a government could consider a study like this and make changes to their digital policies, and that commercial tech platforms, media holding companies, telecoms, and smaller businesses can read these recommendations as they update their AI models, decision algorithms, and the way that data is processed and interacted with. So what we proposed was creating a digital twin. Do you want to describe what a digital twin is?
I always call it like where you exist in this real world, and then you have your digital identity. Yeah? It's like your own twin, but then in a virtual world. It's having your own digital passport. That's how I would describe it.
Yeah,
Because you
it's
can
kind of
use it.
like the metaverse.
Yeah, yeah. And actually, we use it, just for you to know, because I didn't know it at the time when we wrote this grant application. We also use it, for instance, within cities where you have a digital twin, where you have a
Yes.
building has a digital twin.
When I think of digital twin, I usually think of the example about traffic flow patterns. So if you look at a city and you measure the amount of cars and you measure let's say the dust or carbon in the air, and you look at how long people will be at a traffic light. And so urban planners will use this if they want to look at making a new roadway or making more pedestrian street access. And so they combine a real world example to a digital example, and they see what the benefits or negatives are. And it's much faster to produce, and you learn the results right away. So that's part of the reason why we said, let's make a digital twin of a marketplace exchange. So that could be like a Facebook kind of thing or a TV application. In our example for this study, we would just be in a browser window and we would see an example of devices, and it was showing us media. What we were ultimately going to create was a new tool, because that's kind of what the grant money gives you. It lets you build some new tools and have some testing, and then you have to write this report, and you need to open source some of this stuff. But what we were doing was a user interface that was a SaaS management dashboard, so software as a service, where every stakeholder has control over certain parameters. And so the term that I put in there was MapDAC. That's media, AI models, preferences, data, algorithms, and currencies. So, of course, you can't work in tech unless you have a bunch of acronyms that no one understands and a bunch of capital letters. But MapDAC was this concept, like, okay, so it's an everything exchange: media, AI models, preferences, data, algorithms, currency. It sounds kind of nice. And so we're saying if this is a current exchange where you have just normal advertisers, users, people paying for subscriptions, like let's test that out. But also we want to pave the way for how a tokenization environment would work. So you're using alternative media tokens or crypto or something to have the flow of money, or a decentralized ecosystem. So sounds like a lot of work, right? Like you're going to give us this money, we're going to build this ecosystem.
It's powerful, because the fact that we want to add the ethical layer on top of that, it would encourage a lot of awareness. People are not aware. I think it's very powerful because that digital twin would actually help you to be aware of what is happening with your data and how you influence AI and vice versa. And I think it would help enormously when it comes to transparency. It's out there, you can measure it, you can screen it, you can look at it. I think that's the powerfulness of the idea, Michael, is that something that is now hidden behind the scenes, that you bring it up front. That's why I was so enthusiastic about the idea.
Yeah, and I think one of the areas that you really helped with when you looked at the text for the study, I wrote some phases and you said, okay, how about phase 0? We get smarter people to look at this and we look at the ecosystem mapping. We have an advisory board and we look at the knowledge sources. We have experts help us give guidance on best practices. We get buy-in from the OpenAI community. And then we look at how we can build upon this with whatever lessons we learn. And I was like,
Yeah.
oh, that's smart. Why didn't we do that? And then, of course, you said, let's look at the environmental damage that we're causing. How will that influence how somebody's choosing one AI model over a different one?
Yeah.
So yeah, just to try to describe that on a very high level, and we have an ecosystem. There's users, there's advertisers, there's content creators, but really there's this role of who's deciding the decisioning engine. So who's deciding what combination of media, ads, whatever, is being shown to the user. In a perfect world, the user would say, this is exactly what I want, and that's what they get. But we live in a world where there's billions of hours of content, and we need to have the content customized toward us. That's programmatic. But how do we have it be a dialogue where everyone's sitting at the table and talking instead of just somebody coming in and yelling at us and telling us what to do? Or not even, they're controlling it where we don't even know. So this was like, how do we set up this multi-party dialogue? And so what we wanted to do with these participants was have real life people that just were interested in doing a study and having people who actually play these roles in real life. So a real advertiser, somebody that works in a tech company that controls algorithms, and other people, like let's say a nonprofit or somebody from a DAO, like a decentralized autonomous organization. How do we check this? So what we were going to do on a basic level was a knowledge check. So let's just interview people and understand where they are in terms of their knowledge, and then explain how this ecosystem works. And it's really about a playbook. Let's play out these scenarios. You hit this button, you hit that button, and we were going to measure things and collect feedback. And then, of course, as part of the obligation to the study, we would do a data analysis, generate the report, and have our dissemination and give the insights. We didn't know what we were going to learn with these results. Here's the not so big reveal. We did hear back from OpenAI about whether or not we were accepted. We were not accepted, by the way.
Oh no, but it's because we were too visionary and too philosophical. Huh? I have to say, Mike, no, it is like that, Michael. What I experience, and maybe that's why we connect so much. I'm always too early with whatever I do, and I always meet people who are visionaries and who have this vision of the future. I look at the world in post-its and mind maps. I'm not a word person, I'm an image person, and you're the same.
Me too. Yeah, definitely.
So you see all these images and you see all these connections that if you look around, not everyone is experiencing. You can see what is going to happen, sometimes feel what is going to happen, because you see all these post-its out there, those warning signs, and then you say, yeah, but if this happens, this will do this and this. And it's sometimes very difficult to explain. It's almost like AI. It's difficult to explain, but it's going to happen. And then they say, but why? I said, but don't you see that that's there and that's there and that's there? And then you're like, okay, maybe I'm wrong. And then 4 years later, they say, didn't I say that?
Yeah, it's like watching a train wreck happen in slow motion. You're like, this is going to be bad, or this thing is going to happen. It's so obvious. I had a slide that I used to make that said, the future of media is so fucking obvious, but it said, of course it's going to be this way. Of course it's going to be this way. And I had a little asterisk and it said, unless bad actors get in the way from this happening, meaning unless somebody evil like gets in the way, it's inevitable that we're going to be remixing little pieces of content and controlling the way that media is given to us. It's almost like the water always is going to find the ocean or the larger body of
Yeah.
water. And just because you know the future doesn't mean you're making money on it. You know,
No,
that's part
no,
of the
no.
frustration. Money is the economy right now. And it's hard to tell people that work in their existing fields, hey, you're going to have a more difficult time to regulate what you're doing, but it's going to be great for society. That's not really a good, compelling selling point to why people would want to do this.
I would not fear too much that you didn't get a grant. Okay.
It made me think about it a little deeper from different perspectives. To be honest, I thought even if we don't get this, it'd make a good podcast episode. So here we
Yeah,
are.
here we are. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy is that the way the media industry is going, it's not going anywhere. How far can you be detached from the campfire? Remember the reason why you unite people around what is actually the media industry. It's telling stories, and it's the campfire, but in a different way. Let's roll back. Let's imagine that everything we put out there on social media and stuff like that is things we talk about around the campfire. Would it gather people? Would it unite people and bring people together? 99% is rubbish. I had this professor, and he says, because we are so addicted to that digital ting, 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 we are spending so much time, and there's no more time left to think about the essentials we need to live as a human. And the danger is that because we're going so berserk and there's no more breathing space to live as a human, what we need is physical connection, being out in nature, breathing, eating proper food, finding the time to cook. The whole digital world is taking over. You have so many people who are in burnout, going crazy, or demotivated and depressed. I think in Europe we have 1 out of 5 people are suffering from burnout or depression. That's a lot of people we need to support. And now I'm actually working on a nature connectedness program to bring people back to earth, being electronically wired. You know, you have the earth plug. That means if you get an electric shock, then the fuses go off. We don't have the earth plug anymore. So we keep on overheating. And I think unless we find a balance to have enough time to skip the whole digital thing, our brain is going to melt, I think.
Yeah, that is one of the benefits that people have from walking around without shoes on, just feel the actual earth on a meditative level, on a sensorial level, and probably on some bioelectric component that we can't really measure right now. But in Japanese, they have that word forest bathing.
I'm a forest bathing guide.
Oh, really? Okay, I love that. I was in Michigan a few weeks ago, and even just driving in the woods, we were like, oh, we're forest bathing. We went out and walked in the nature, and you can feel a difference in your body. And there must be some balance between the digital technology world, which I do appreciate and I'm always drawn to because that's always a new frontier. But there's this other earth connection, internal, almost psychological, maybe some people would say spiritual. I think as a person who's not a follower of traditional religions, sometimes when I think about what does religion mean to me, the words I write are awe, like just looking at stars and being amazed by it, or time in nature. Those are things where I'm like, you know what, this checks my religion box. And it's actually kind of more similar to what people were doing 10,000 years ago than they are now. So that's interesting for me. Wow, we went off on a tangent. Okay, so let's say one more thing about AI, and then I want to talk about your eco stuff and Renaissance artists and the Dada movement. So one of the questions that was asked at the end of the application was, in your view, what are the top 3 benefits that AI brings to society? Do you want to answer anything that comes to your mind right now?
What would be great, for instance, we're running out of resources in the planet. If we could use AI to reuse, refurbish, remake, and really prevent us from creating more garbage than whatever garbage we're producing today.
Yeah,
So I
like
think
whole systems manufacturing. So looking at the inputs and outputs
yeah,
and
yeah.
sort of the life cycle of an item over time, which certain environmental scientists know that, but we don't do that. We create something and we don't consider the cost of the destruction of that item. Kind of related to that, we wrote in the application about the benefits that AI brings to society is that bureaucratic and technical processes can be implemented much faster, which can make governmental systems run more efficiently. What do you think about that? Do you think governments can actually use AI to be faster with applications or with studies?
It all depends on
Let's assume that it's
what
ethical. Let's assume that
because
it's run the right way in our future
yeah,
utopia.
yes.
Is there a positive potential of AI in government?
The one thing I wonder is the difference between automation and AI, because we tend to forget that we could already take it to a very high level without AI and just using automated processes. For instance, now today, if I want my birth certificate, I can just order it online and just get it without having to travel and ask for an appointment. That's automation. So the question is, what do you need to predict? Because I think the biggest strength of AI is prediction. And where it could be very beneficial is if you look at Europe now, temperatures go berserk. South of Europe, we have 48 degrees in Spain, I believe. It could help, for instance, to predict which zones in a city will be too hot for people to live in. I think it has a very beneficial use if you use it for societal things that really bring something to society, because then you could say, okay, now it is worth using it because it's helping humanity and the planet and it makes us a better society. Because then you can say, okay, now it is okay to use something that's so polluting because it's also giving something back.
Well, that's an example of a smart city and a 15-minute city that isn't bad if it's managed correctly. There's
Yeah.
potential for good and bad.
Imagine, the public transport, that you
Uh-huh.
have clever AI that really predicts and that you can step on the bus at the end of your street and that it's there when you want it to be there. That would be great.
Yeah, let's replace cars with that. That sounds good to me. So one
Yeah.
of the reasons why we might have also not been selective is they ask questions like, "Oh, what are the top 3 benefits in your mind?" And of course, I write 4 because I write. Side note: there are also many we don't know what we don't know scenarios that can also be discovered through the use of AI, which is exciting. So I wanted to at least leave it on a note where we say, first of all, I think it's cool that they ask that. They want to end on an exciting note and ask you what's cool about AI. But I think it's going to be used for things that we haven't even thought about. We won't know until we approach it and we say, oh, that was a really good use for that. I think one
Of
example is
course.
kind of like Web3 and AI and how blockchain is a good way to determine edits made by AI. But where does the power come from? Is that sustainable? Is that from windmills? Is that from gas burning? Is that coal? Like that's very different if you're using electricity and it comes from those sources.
Maybe the sustainability was one bridge to. You
Yeah,
open the box of Pandora, because
I
they don't
definitely
want to
did.
hear that. They don't want to hear that.
I want to hear a little bit more. I know we're getting to a close. One thing that I heard about the Renaissance, and so Belgium and the northern countries in Europe, was there was almost a later Renaissance that happened there. And it was influenced from what was happening in Italy and southern Europe, but it took a little while to get there. But one shift that happened was that there was a consideration of the individual and that there is an artist and a citizen. So who am I in my country? Who am I as a person? Who am I as an artist? And there were examples of beautiful paintings and a lot of Gothic architecture. So when you were learning in school about the Renaissance period, like what sticks out in your mind that was interesting or that you still remember or have thoughts about?
I went out with some friends and we ended around a good Belgian beer, which I all advise you to drink. And after a couple of beers on their side, because I still had to drive, we ended up in art, and we even talked about the Dadaist, and that's something completely different.
Well, let's
But
talk about that because you have a lot that you could talk about with the Dada movement.
yeah, the Dada movement, but it's the power of a few people. And that's why I think, Michael, you're great. You should keep doing what you're doing, because it was only 8 people and they started conversations with each other. And by having these letters, they were influenced and they started the Dada movement. For instance, they had a toilet pot sitting in a room, and that was like art. They were against establishment. They even influenced the way the whole graphic scene, the way, because they took letters and they used it as an art form, because they said communication, it's an art form. So it's quite interesting to see the Dadaist movement. And we said we're in the same area where we have to rethink of whatever we're doing and look at it as a kind of art form to give people the chance to see how absurd everything is. You could call it the Monty Pythons in the art form, where they look at things and they let you see how stupid it is. And everyone is pretending it's okay.
So just to give some more context, I looked up real quick the Dada movement, DADA,
Yeah.
and the MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art, describes it as an artistic and literary movement formed in response to World War, which was 1914 to 1918, and it was a modern media and machine culture. So they wanted to expose what was our accepted and repressive conventions of order and logic, and they wanted to embrace chance, spontaneity, and irreverence. So there's critical thinking, it was satire, it was judgment, it was like taking a step back and saying, let's mess all of this up. And it was in response to moving past a painful period of history. So they were saying, okay, who cares about classic art anymore? We just like tried to blow up the country next to us, get destroyed. Let's create this new movement. And I think that actually has a lot in common with the Renaissance, where the Renaissance, several hundred-year period, but literally means rebirth, and it means accepting new perspectives. So I think Dada movement's actually a great connection to talk about here. What's your connection to the Dada movement? Dadaism,
Well,
as they say.
it's quite strange because when I did my interior design course, I had to pick interiors and I came across Theo van Doesburg. And Theo van Doesburg is actually one of the artists who influenced Mondrian. And I'm not sure if someone
Mhm.
knows, sees those paintings with
The
lines
squares.
and squares. That's Mondrian. And actually, it's because of his connection with Mondrian that Mondrian started to put his paintings not square, but on an angle. If you read what they were talking about, actually, they were debating about the whole absurdity of life. It was only 8 people, but the way they communicated and they influenced each other, they actually inspired the whole movement and a lot of other artists to rethink what they were doing and helping them to zoom out. I did art school and stuff like that. I never felt very at ease in the whole art scene. I remember going to a vernissage and I was the only one dressed in red. Everyone else was black. And I was like not fitting in the scene because there's a kind of ethics and the way you need to move and the whole it's very dominating culture. So I always felt like I was not part of that scene. So when I did the 4 years of art school, my teacher said, "You're stuck." I said, "Yes, I'm stuck. What am I doing here? I don't have a story to tell." And she put me in this little corner and she said, "Why don't you just do whatever you want to do?" And the moment I went complete berserk, I could really do conceptual art, where I combined video with stuff. And then I had drawings of very complex, dark layers. But for me, it was not dark. It was a way of telling a story. And I always felt like very at home with the Dadaist. So when I had my own art gallery, I called it the Galerie Dada. I went to this art fair and I just rolled out grass. It was just plastic grass, and I put a toilet seat on top of that. And they were like, everyone's like, "She's, what's this crazy girl doing here?" And I said, "Well, it's Galerie Dada. I don't want boundaries. I want it to be open for everyone. And it doesn't matter if you're a peasant or if you're doing labor. There's no poshness, and there's no ethics or rules or conditioned ways you need to behave to be exploring this." And it was quite interesting because I always combined two artists together that not necessarily had a connection, but by doing it, something different happened. So I was always like my own curator of my own expos. And I felt that when people came, normally people visit an art gallery and they're in for 5 minutes and then they're gone. And the people who visited, they always stayed a half an hour, because they felt like, what's this? It's odd. It's accessible. I can read what is there, but there's a layer to it that I don't understand. And I think that's a bit the Dadaist. I will never be part of a group. I will always be a little bit, I think, odd in the way I think and the way I see the world. But I like the Dadaist. I just say what I have to say. So
Yeah, that has a lot in common with the sort of movement of the Renaissance and evolution, but the Dada movement was really about rejecting normal conventional society. And there was a piece called Fountain by Marcel Duchamp.
yeah,
There was like a urinal, a porcelain urinal, and that was considered
yeah.
art, and it really caused a reaction. So the fact that you're doing a toilet seat on grass that's plastic and you're getting a reaction from people, that really has
Yeah,
to
yeah.
connect to that, to
And
those
and
roots.
and what is interesting about the Renaissance, I think, if you make the connection, is that because I've been looking a little bit at the garden designs in the Renaissance, and what is quite interesting is that it was all about reconnecting. The Renaissance gardens, if you look at the house, the Villa de Medici in Italy and stuff like that, by now diving into it again, it was about creating these places that were quite sustainable because they made it as such so that you could walk around the garden even when it was sunny. There was these areas where you could hide in the shade. There were these areas in the winter where sun was captured and you could sit. So it was quite clever thinking, and they had these grots and stuff like that, which also helped you to cool down when it was sunny. But what is interesting is that they wanted to create these places where people could talk again to each other and do philosophical stuff. And I think that's a little bit what I said that we're missing in this age now, is that the physical connection, getting back together and talking about stuff and really reflecting and I think that was powerful in the Renaissance.
Yeah, well, they say in the tech world, the walled garden is where you're in sort of like a safe space that's technology, but also you're kind of controlled. So I looked up just now what the Renaissance gardens were about, and it was about peace, serenity, reflection. Because back in the day, if you were in the wilderness in the woods, you might get attacked, you might find animals that could hurt you, and all that stuff. Whereas when you have this garden, that's this world that you've created, you're celebrating humanity and nature and life, but you've invested enough time or effort, or someone else did, to feel safe and to allow your mind to expand. So we've seen different
Yeah.
versions of that in history. But it's funny because we talk about the digital walled gardens and then these Renaissance gardens, and how it is about this reflection and context and zooming out. So I think that this has come full circle.
Yeah, I think so
Well,
too. Yeah.
okay. Well, I know we're running out of time here, so thank you so much. It was so great to talk to you about all these concepts, and I'm glad you didn't hold back and that, that you shared your opinion on all this stuff. I have a feeling it's not the last time we will be
Oh
collaborating, or
no.
at least telling the world what we think should be happening. So, thank you
Yeah,
so
we
much
have
for
to keep
discussing
on
these
doing
ideas.
that. Yeah.
We do have to keep on doing it. And I think that it's interesting to see how the Media Motor Europe alumni and mentors and community evolves,
Yeah.
and where they move on from there. And hopefully it makes reverberations. Maybe it's its own Dada movement, maybe a little less angry, but it could be its own Dada movement that makes an impact in the world in some way.
Yeah.
So thank you very much. Yeah.
Keep
And
up the good work.
oh, thank you. Yeah, so this is the Media Renaissance Show. Thank you for watching, and have a good one.
Bye.